Midnight on the coast highway. The fog comes in low, thick, tasting of salt and gasoline. A single car sits in a narrow garage above a glittering Mediterranean-style cafe, engine silent, metal still holding the memory of recent heat. Inside the coupe, a young woman in a mink coat slumps against the steering wheel, perfect face at an impossible angle, lipstick smeared just enough to disturb the illusion of a studio still. Her name is Thelma Todd. In the morning, newspapers will tell America she fell asleep in her car, that exhaust fumes did what mobsters, jealous lovers, and studio bosses never could. Accidental death. Case closed. No trial, no conspiracy, nothing to see. You can accept that. Or you can listen to what the witnesses really said, what the photographs really show, and what the paper trail behind her father and her business partners reveals.
Because once you start pulling on the threads around this single dead starlet, a whole hidden tapestry of Hollywood money, Masonic power, and ritualized violence begins to show through. This is not just about one woman in one garage. It is about how an entire city learned to smile for the camera while bleeding for the mob. The official story is simple. Too simple. A successful actress, exhausted from late nights and champagne, supposedly drives up the hill above her own cafe, leaves the engine on, and drifts off while carbon monoxide quietly steals her breath. An accident, tragic but banal. Except there were neighbors who heard shouting hours earlier. Except there was a bruise on her lip that did not match a soft fading away. Except there were political phone calls the night before that no one wanted to admit making. And except for one inconvenient fact.
The man who had everything to gain from her silence had connections that reached from Hollywood sound stages back to East Coast lodges and city halls with a square and compass hung behind closed doors. To understand why that matters, you have to leave the Pacific fog behind for a minute and go back to a cramped wooden house in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and a little girl who watched her father entertain men in dark suits. Thelma was born into a household where uniforms and influence were the real family heirlooms. Her father, John Shaw Todd, wore a police badge before he wore tailored political suits. He began as a beat cop in a mill town brutalized by industrial money. In the alleys and tenement stairwells of Lawrence, he learned something very simple and very dangerous. The law was not a set of commandments. It was a tool, and whoever gripped the handle hardest decided where it struck. Colleagues remembered that he moved up faster than made sense. One year, he was the young lieutenant who knew which speakeasy to leave alone and which to raid for the newspapers. A few years later, he was sitting behind a big wooden desk as Director of Public Health and Welfare for the entire state of Massachusetts. A man who could move funds with a signature and make or break construction contracts with a quiet word. That title sounds dry. It was anything but. Public health and welfare in those years meant hospitals, asylums, work programs, food supplies. It meant streams of money flowing from the state into private hands, for building, for medicines, for equipment that often existed more on paper than in reality. It meant a chance to offer state jobs to loyal men and to choke off funding to enemies. No one hands that kind of power to a small-town policeman by accident. Behind the respectable title, there were all the familiar signals of a man who had learned to trade loyalty for advancement. He entertained party operatives and businessmen in his parlor. He arranged appointments to advisory boards that never met but always paid. He slid state funds towards certain charitable organizations that seemed to exist mostly on letterhead. And he did what so many men in his position did in that era. He joined the lodges. In New England politics of the early 20th century, Masonic membership was not a hobby. It was a passport. Police chiefs, judges, legislators, bankers, all met under the same symbols,
wore the same aprons, repeated the same oaths about mutual aid. Those rituals did more than create a sense of brotherhood. They created a second layer of obligation under the law, a promise that when one brother was in trouble, other brothers would ensure the system bent rather than broke. The records are careful not to shout this,
But when you trace who sponsored John Todd for certain posts, who co-signed loans, who introduced him at key banquets, the same family names recur, the same surnames that appear in the quiet histories of secret societies and elite banking circles. Researchers of Illuminati bloodlines point out that the Todd line intersects with older families, like Collins, that were already marked in esoteric lore as carrying certain obligations. You do not have to believe every word of that to notice the pattern. A policeman becomes a state power broker. A daughter of that house becomes something else. Thelma watched these men come and go. She saw the stiff hats lined in the hallway, smelled the cigar smoke that seeped under her bedroom door on nights when deals were struck over whiskey. She heard the low laughter when someone mentioned a judge by first name. She learned early that there were two conversations in any room, the one people spoke out loud, and the one that lived in raised eyebrows and unfinished sentences. At school, she was bright and restless. On the streets, boys noticed her. Adults did too. Teachers joked she had a stage face, the kind of bone structure that cameras loved even before she had ever seen a movie set. In church, older women clucked about her figure and warned her mother that the city chews up girls like that. Years later, a biographer would claim that as a teenager she privately fantasized about running a brothel, not because she wanted to sell sex, but because she instinctively grasped that whoever controlled pleasure controlled men. Whether that anecdote is literal truth or not, it captures something real. Thelma understood, from very young, that there was a marketplace for desire, and she meant to be on the selling side, not the buying side. Then came the pageant. In her early 20s, the local Elks Lodge sponsored her in a statewide beauty contest.
On the surface, it was a wholesome civic event, complete with marching bands and small-town newspaper photos. Behind the scenes, it was also a scouting ground, one of many pipelines that fed young women into the Hollywood machine. The story the studios later preferred to tell is clean and flattering. They talk about how a talent scout with a good eye saw something special in the laughing blonde from Lawrence, about how America loved her natural charm. What the contracts and correspondence from that summer hint at is rougher. Studio representatives in sharp suits met with her father. They wanted assurances that his daughter would be sent west, that she would be available for certain publicity tours, that inconvenient local attachments would not get in the way of the image they wanted to build. For a man like John Todd, this was not a moral question. It was a business proposition. He had already learned that titles and uniforms were costumes.
Now his daughter was being offered a different uniform, silk instead of wool, but just another role in the same larger play. He signed the papers. Whether he believed the studio executives were simply manufacturers of dreams or understood that gangsters already had stakes in distribution and labor on the West Coast, he had to know one thing. Once Thelma got on the train, her life would no longer be under his sole control. She arrived in California into a town that smelled of orange blossoms and fear. Hollywood in the late 1920s was not the glittering myth you see in nostalgia reels. It was a boomtown run on 5 main addictions: money, fame, sex, narcotics, and control. The studios owned their actors through long-term contracts. The mob owned large portions of the nightlife, the gambling, and the drugs. The cops answered quietly to both. Thelma came in as comic relief. Producers quickly realized that when you put her in front of a camera and gave her a smart line, audiences lit up. They called her Hot Toddy, a name that invited both affection and objectification.
She worked with major comedians, took pratfalls in gowns, let studio publicists photograph her in bathing suits while joking about how bad she had it compared to serious actresses. On magazine covers, she was the dizzy blonde. On ledgers, she was an asset. She earned steady salaries, enough to buy nice houses, fur coats, a fleet of cars. But for every dollar that passed through her hands, many more flowed up the chain. To studio bosses who carved up territories like feudal lords. To East Coast theater owners tied into organized crime. To unions that were sometimes tools for worker protection, and sometimes just another racket. And the more successful she became, the more attractive she looked, not just to men who wanted to date a movie star, but to men who wanted to use one.
The restaurant was her attempt to change that balance. On the coast highway, in a then sparsely developed stretch of Pacific Palisades, an elegant building rose with arched windows and a terrace overlooking the ocean. It was called Thelma Todd's Sidewalk Cafe. The concept was simple and ingenious. Movie stars could lunch there publicly, with fans watching from the road, while private rooms upstairs hosted more intimate meetings. Officially, the cafe was owned and operated by her partner, director Roland West, and backed by his financier associate. Unofficially, it sat at a crossroads between studio money and gangland roots. The highway was a perfect artery for running liquor and numbers between downtown Los Angeles and the beach communities. A busy cafe provided cover for cash, for conversations, for people arriving at odd hours who claimed to be meeting a producer, but might in fact be meeting a bookmaker. That was when Charles Luciano noticed her.
Lucky Luciano, already a legend in New York underworld, had interests reaching west. He understood that nightclubs were more than places to drink. They were hubs in a network of control. According to multiple accounts from the time, he saw Thelma's cafe not just as a pleasant lunch stop, but as prime real estate for a private casino. A third-floor gaming room would be perfect. Discreet, profitable, easy to fold into existing operations. Thelma objected. She was willing to be near the line. She was not willing, at least at first, to step entirely over it. She liked the idea of a classy establishment, not a mob casino. She liked powerful men at her tables, but she wanted to believe she served them on her terms. Saying no to a man like Luciano was not a romantic gesture. It was a move in a very old game, and it put her on the wrong side of a very simple equation. Women in Hollywood who cooperated with the machine, who laundered its sins with their smiles, tended to live.
Those who refused, who threatened either revenue streams or the illusion of control, tended to have short careers and complicated deaths. There is a moment, described by a former employee years later, that captures the shift. One night, long after midnight, staff had already gone home. A handful of men remained at the upstairs bar, clothes loosened, ties hanging. Thelma had slipped off her shoes and perched on a stool, laughing a little too loudly, the way people do when they are tired but afraid to leave. In a lull, while the gramophone needle hissed in a groove between songs, one of the men leaned under the bar with a penknife and carved a small symbol into the wood. The witness could not describe it precisely. He remembered a triangle, maybe, with lines through it, and the way the room went slightly quiet as the others watched, then relaxed when the man straightened up and clapped Thelma on the shoulder. She frowned, but said nothing. To her, it was probably just another drunken flourish. To the men who had spent years in lodges and back rooms, it was understood. A mark, a claim, a reminder that this was now a space under a certain protection. To decode that small moment, you have to look beyond mob folklore and into the broader networks that ran America at the time. Freemasonry was at its peak in the early decades of the 20th century. Judges, sheriffs, city council members, industrialists, studio executives, all swore oaths inside windowless rooms decorated with checkerboard floors and twin pillars. These lodges were not abstract conspiracies. They were literal meeting places where men who controlled banks, courts, and police forces drank together and learned who could be trusted. Everyone knew that initiation involved secrets. New members memorized phrases and handshakes, promising to protect one another under penalty of mutilation and death. For many, it was pageantry, nothing more.
For some, it became a private law above public law. That is where Masonic influence intersects with organized crime. When a detective who belongs to the lodge is assigned a case that implicates a fellow brother, even indirectly, the pressure to look away is immense. Hollywood grew up inside that environment. Studio heads hired security chiefs who had cut their teeth as strikebreakers and who also wore lodge pins. Producers invested in fraternal charities that, in return, helped smooth zoning disputes. Police chiefs reapplied the logic they had perfected in eastern cities. They raided small fry night spots to appease reformers and ignored the big rooms that paid the right men and flashed the right rings. In that atmosphere, a cafe like Thelma's was not just a restaurant, it was a node. Money from East Coast families needed West Coast landing zones. Politicians in California needed campaign cash.
Masons in both places needed venues where they could trade favors outside of any state building. A charismatic actress with a father already tied into political patronage networks was a perfect bridge. Thelma herself was not a card-carrying initiate. These societies did not enroll women in the same way. But elite networks always have parallel tracks. While husbands met in tiled rooms, their wives and mistresses moved in social circles that were just as strategic. Wives ran charity balls where donors exchanged knowing nods. Actresses hosted parties where directors brought their favorite protégés to impress backers. There are stories, whispered by old Hollywood hands long after the fact, of Thelma attending gatherings in secluded mansions above Sunset Boulevard, where astrologers charted studio release dates, numerologists advised on contract signing days, and certain guests retired to paneled libraries to recite phrases lifted straight from Masonic rituals, reshaped for a new audience. At those parties, vodka mixed with incense. The gramophones and later jazz bands provided cover, but in side rooms, tarot cards appeared on velvet, hands clasped in circles around flickering candles. Occult America was not a sideshow. It was becoming a fashion among the elite. Executives who in public quoted the Bible, in private asked mediums to contact dead partners for investment advice. Directors timed shoots to planetary hours. Agents carried amulets in their pockets, along with their business cards. For a woman like Thelma, who had grown up seeing religion used as a tool and politics as street magic, this was both familiar and new. She joked about it in interviews. Reporters liked to print lighthearted lines about how she would gladly sell her soul for one more hit picture, or how she needed a lucky charm to survive her stunt scenes. Behind the quips, there are hints that she sensed something more serious at work. Colleagues remembered her going quiet when certain names were mentioned, or changing the subject when someone brought up a producer known to hold lodge meetings in his home. All the while, the numbers rose. Her cafe made good money in the early years. Lunch crowds from studios, weekend crowds from the wealthy communities up the coast. Her film work kept pace, not at the very top of the pyramid, but high enough that she was always in motion, always on a set or in a costume fitting, or rushing back to the cafe to charm investors. The flow of cash, though, did not stay tidy. There were rumors of new silent partners demanding their cut, men whose names never appeared on paper. Deliveries began to arrive at odd hours. Certain tables were reserved for card games that never appeared on the official entertainment schedule. One of the staff later described a backroom safe that seemed to fill and empty constantly, stuffed with bills bundled in ways that did not match the restaurant receipts.
The pattern is familiar to anyone who has studied how the mob uses legitimate businesses. You take a real enterprise with real profit. You layer in unrecorded income from gambling, from betting slips, from side deals.
You inflate or deflate invoices to move dirty money into clean channels. If anyone asks, you point to the star on the sign out front and talk about celebrity overhead, about the cost of doing business in style. Into this flow walked Thelma's father. By the early 1930s, John Todd was no longer the young upstart. He was a seasoned operative with decades inside the democratic machine of his state. Although he remained physically rooted back east, his reach did not stop at the state line. He had met enough national figures, shaken enough hands at conventions, that a call from him to a counterpart in Los Angeles would at least be taken. When he visited California, locals treated him with what one observer later called excessive respect.
Here was a man whose political signature represented control over health inspections, liquor licensing, and charitable status for businesses back home. If he vouched for the legitimacy of his daughter's venture, that meant something. It made it easier for Hollywood banks to offer favorable terms. It made it easier for other Eastern interests to follow the same path. In public, he was the proud father. In private, he asked hard questions about profit margins, partners, and security. According to some accounts, he did not like what he found. He saw the grip that men like Luciano were attempting to tighten on the cafe. Where a more submissive parent might have advised quiet compliance, he allegedly encouraged his daughter to resist, to hold the line, to refuse to let her name be used as cover for open vice. That advice may have been brave. It may also have been fatal. Hollywood was not a place that rewarded half measures.
Once you took money from certain hands, you had to keep taking it, or pay it back in blood. Once you opened your doors to certain circles, you could not suddenly decide to close them. Even men with substantial police and Masonic backing found that out the hard way when they overstepped. There is one story, largely forgotten in mainstream retellings, that shows just how tangled the lines had become. On a late night not long before her death, Thelma allegedly placed a phone call to a contact back east. Some versions say it was to her father, others name a political ally of his. What is consistent is the core detail. She said she was in trouble. She said she was caught between powerful men. She said things were happening at the cafe that she could not control. No one has ever publicly produced the transcript of that call, but long after the coroner signed off, a retired police clerk hinted that an internal memo existed, summarizing a request from another state that Los Angeles authorities keep a closer eye on a certain establishment on the Coast Highway. That clerk claimed the memo was filed, stamped, and quietly buried in a drawer with dozens of others. When questioned, senior officers denied any formal warning. They fell back on the same line that would become the refrain of this entire case. It was a tragic accident. A foolish woman made a foolish mistake. There was no larger story to tell. Yet there is one more layer that cannot be ignored if you are serious about following the money and decoding the power structure around this death. In the months leading up to her final night, Thelma began to speak more candidly about her frustration with the way roles were offered, withdrawn, then dangled again in front of her whenever she displeased someone. Friends recalled her describing a producer who told her, in a quiet corner away from others, that actresses were like chips in a poker game. In his words, the men who truly ran the industry shuffled them across the table as needed, regardless of their own wishes. She started to hint at wanting out of the cafe, out of contract games, out of the more extreme parties in the hills where, she told one confidant, things happened that would destroy careers if ever filmed. She was not yet ready to give names, but she was circling close to something elites in any age fear above all. A witness who both understands the network and is willing to talk. This is where the idea of secret society initiation stops being an abstraction and becomes a living pressure on one woman. No one ever formally blindfolded Thelma and led her through an altar room to recite ancient words.
Yet by the time she took her last drive up that hill, she had passed through her own series of degrees.
First as a policeman's daughter watching the small-scale rituals of local power. Then as a contract player in the studio system, learning who could make or break her with a phone call. Then as a business owner situated at the exact crossroads of mob, lodge, and movie money. Every step up increased her view. Every step up also increased the fall. The last confirmed sightings of her alive show a woman at a party, laughing a little too hard, tension showing in the tightness around her eyes. Witnesses later disagreed on the details of what was said when she left, whether she fought with her partner, whether she stormed out in a fury, or drifted away in drunken sadness. What no one disputes is this. Before dawn, she was dead in a car that may or may not have been running, in a garage that may or may not have been fully closed, with injuries that may or may not match the smooth narrative of sleep and suffocation that the coroner wrote.
Over the years, various researchers have pulled at these contradictions, raising possibilities from simple manslaughter to deliberate execution. Some go further, arguing that the staging of her death was not just practical, but symbolic, matching older patterns of ritualized removal used when elites decide a wayward asset must be eliminated, and their demise turned into a kind of message. That larger pattern, the one that connects a motionless body in a California garage to older rites of sacrifice and power, belongs to another layer of this story. For now, it is enough to say this. The woman found in that car was not simply a careless actress. She was the daughter of a political operator tied into fraternal networks, the owner of a building coveted as a gambling den, and a reluctant participant at the fringes of an occult-tinged social circle that believed certain deaths could have meaning beyond mere convenience.
In the next part of this investigation, we will look more closely at the night of her death itself, at the precise movements of the men around her, at the symbols carved into wood and inked into membership rolls, at why some witnesses changed their stories and others were never called at all, and at why killing her once was not enough. They also had to rewrite her into a cautionary tale. December 3, 1935. The Pacific waves crash below the cliffs, indifferent as always. A maroon coupe sits in a rented garage above the cafe, door half open to the salty air. Thelma Todd, 30 years old, beautiful even in death, slumps forward. Her nose bleeds, her lip is split, no soot in her lungs, engine cold. The neighbors heard everything. Across the highway, a woman later testified she watched two men force Thelma out of another car and up the stairs around 2 in the morning, shouting, a scuffle. One man tall, broad-shouldered, the other shorter, insistent.
Thelma protesting, keys shaking in her hand. Then silence, broken only by the waves. Down the road, another witness heard the same argument. Clear words carried on the fog. Something about money owed. Something about the cafe becoming a problem. A threat that if she kept talking to the wrong people, no amount of Daddy's connections would save her. The tall man matched Roland West, her business partner and lover. The shorter one fit descriptions of a Luciano enforcer known to frequent the upstairs rooms. West claimed he found her at dawn, engine running, a tragic mistake. But the mechanic who serviced her cars said that coupe had no exhaust leaks, and the blood on her face suggested a blow before any fumes. Police arrived quickly, too quickly for some. The lead detective carried a Masonic ring. The coroner attended the same lodge. Within hours, the narrative locked into place. Accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. No full autopsy. No fingerprints on the wheel. Case closed before lunch.
But the real work was just beginning. Across the country,
John Todd got the call. His daughter, the golden ticket he had packaged and shipped west, now a liability. He pulled strings quietly. Massachusetts politicians phoned California counterparts. Favors traded. Stories aligned. The press, fed by studio publicists with their own lodge ties, ran the approved line. Tired starlet. Careless night. Hollywood's price of fame. Luciano's men cleaned the upstairs rooms that week. Gaming tables vanished. Safe emptied. New staff hired, the kind who saw nothing. The cafe reopened under West's sole name, profits flowing smoother without Thelma's questions. Yet the symbols lingered. That carved mark under the bar remained. A triangle pierced by a dagger. Not random graffiti. Masonic penal sign for entered apprentice, the oath every brother swears. Throat cut ear to ear, tongue torn out, heart ripped free if secrets are revealed. Thelma had seen too much, heard too much. Her death was not just convenient. It was instructional. For the women who watched from dressing rooms, for the starlets who wondered if resistance was worth the risk, for the cafe owners who thought they could skim from the house take, Hollywood absorbed the lesson. Careers rose and fell on invisible signals. A producer's offhand comment about a rival's lodge standing, an agent's whisper about which party to attend, which symbols to wear. The machine ran smoother when everyone understood the oaths, even without reciting them. Years passed. West drank himself into silence, haunted by what he knew. Luciano expanded west, untouched by federal heat until his own empire grew too bold. John Todd retired to quiet bitterness, his political favors drying up without the daughter as leverage. But the pattern repeated. Jean Harlow, platinum blonde successor, dead at 26 from kidney failure, no autopsy allowed. Her husband, a dentist with mob ties, conveniently overdosed days before.
Carol Lombard, outspoken about studio control, plane crash under suspicious fog. Too many crashes, too many overdoses, too many garages with cold engines. Each time the lodges closed ranks. Detectives looked away. Coroners signed fast. Newspapers printed the clean version. Thelma's Cafe stood for decades, a monument to the formula. Celebrity facade, mob money underneath, Masonic protection overhead. Diners ate chowder on the terrace, oblivious to the safe that once held blood money, the bar that bore its warning. Soldiers came home from the war. Television replaced the silver screen. Rock and roll shook the culture. But the back rooms stayed the same. Men in suits met upstairs, traded envelopes, carved their signs into the wood. You see it still. Corporate logos with all-seeing eyes. Studio backlots with windowless buildings called The Tomb. Executives wearing rings with double-headed eagles. Parties in the hills where champagne flows and mediums chart the next blockbuster's release.
Thelma Todd was no saint. She played the game, took the cash, enjoyed the spotlight. But she crossed a line. She asked questions when silence was required. She threatened to name the brothers who treated her cafe as a chapter house. Her death taught Hollywood the real script. Fame is rented, never owned. Beauty buys time, not immunity. And when the lodge calls collection, no father in Massachusetts, no lawyer in Beverly Hills, no publicist in the trades can rewrite the ending. Now picture this. You drive that coast highway at dusk. Fog rolls in just like it did that night. The old cafe spot gleams under new paint, serving brunch to influencers who post about the view. Up the hill, the garage is gone, paved over for parking. But if you stop your car, kill the engine, listen close, you hear it. Raised voices on the wind. A woman's laugh turning sharp. The scrape of a knife under wood. America tells you it was an accident. The documents say otherwise. The symbols
never lie.
Now that you understand how one woman's garage became a ritual of control, you need to see who funded the men who carved those symbols. The bloodlines that sent John Todd east and Luciano west. And the 13 families who still meet in rooms without windows. That story leads straight to the banker dynasties who own the studios today. Subscribe. Share this truth. The next garage waits.